Okay, this is the case for war. It's a significant country in the Middle East. It sits on top of one of the biggest reservoirs of oil, which is of enormous strategic importance to the industrialised world. It has a leader who is a tyrant, who treats his own people with contempt. And here's the killer. It has weapons which can be deployed not just against its neighbours, but potentially against Western countries in Europe. Weapons that could be deployed with horrific effect in really short order. No, it's not Iran, it's Iraq, because exactly the same range of arguments that were deployed in the run-up to this recent US-Israel attack on Iran were deployed in the run-up to the war on Iraq. And there is one other parallel that needs to be drawn, and that is in 2003 and 2026, we're seeing the brutal, naked exercise of imperialist power. Any idea that the US was kinder and softer before Trump came along should be dismissed absolutely. So on the 20th of March 2003, the so-called Coalition of the Willing, the United States, backed up by Britain and to a smaller extent Australia, Denmark and Poland, invaded Iraq. And the then US President George W. Bush said, "Our mission is to disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, to end Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism," and Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq, "and to free the Iraqi people." None of that came to pass because all of those excuses turned out to be absolutely fraudulent. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Millions were displaced in Iraq, and there was a new system of sectarian slaughter and civil war, which meant that the Iraqi people actually lived through decades of horror following the Western invasion. And of course, there were never weapons of mass destruction. That was a simple and total lie. And to some of you, this may just appear to be a history lesson. But actually, Australian troops did not withdraw from Iraq until 2008, 5 years after the invasion. But they were back in Iraq in 2014 to fight ISIS. And even I found this surprising. The last Australian troops were withdrawn from Iraq in 2024. So this isn't ancient history. This is framing for the latest round of imperialist horror in the Middle East. And the impact of the war and the movement against the war has shaped what is happening in front of our eyes today. So the United States was humiliated first in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, and established really a reason why the US ruling class wanted to go to war again in order to establish its strength and its power. The project for the new American century, which was the manifesto of the US ruling class back in 2002, 2003, was left in tatters by the outcome of the war, by the defeat of the United States and its allies. And the people running the United States in the beginning of this millennium, they were known as neoconservatives. They dominated the White House. They dominated the upper echelons of the ruling class, were very cocky. They were very arrogant. The Soviet Union had gone. They'd won the Cold War. China was not yet the kind of imperialist adversary that it is today. There was a sense that, as George Bush put it, there could be a new world order. And by that, what they meant was the US could restructure the world in the interests of US capitalism. And the reality is the Iraq War destroyed that hope, or at least set it back. The US ruling class went into Iraq in 2003, among other things, hoping to wipe out what was known as the Vietnam syndrome. The US put tens, possibly hundreds of thousands, certainly many, many thousand troops into Vietnam and there was a substantial number of casualties, killed, wounded and maimed. And it was a major driver of the anti-war movement in the United States, blowback against the Vietnam War. And working class people basically said, why are we sending our sons, sometimes our daughters, into a war zone? What was it for? Why was it about? We don't want to make that sacrifice again. And for a generation, the US ruling class held back from substantial troop movements or boots on the ground intervention. And they saw in Iraq a quick win. George Bush said it was going to be a cakewalk, over very quickly. Sound familiar? And that would re-establish the legitimacy of US soldiers going in to fight imperialist wars. And the result, the defeat in Iraq, contributed to the situation today where the US is loath to put soldiers on the ground against Iran. They want regime change, maybe, they want a political outcome, but what they're not prepared to do is put the hundreds of thousands of soldiers it would take to defeat Iran absolutely. They're not prepared to put them on the ground. So the big military build-up was ships, submarines, it was missiles and it was planes, but it wasn't soldiers. And that is an outcome of the Iraq War. The anti-war movement, which I'll go on to describe in a little while, also the memory and in some cases the organisational structures linger on 24 years later, to a greater or lesser extent. There is certainly, even where there's no great movement on the ground, a much greater scepticism about what the West is involved in, or about what the US is involved in, a much greater pushback against Labour getting Australia involved, and a rejection of sending troops into harm's way. And in Britain, where the anti-war movement was particularly strong, 2 million people marched through London in 2003 against the Iraq War. The Stop the War coalition is still capable of putting hundreds of thousands onto the streets against the Palestinian genocide, tens of thousands on the streets against the war in Iran. So one of the products of the war was that people learnt to look through the lies. And I think the last impact of the Iraq war on the current situation was because America was defeated in Iraq, it opened a space for proxies and allies of Iran to take power in Baghdad. And that opened the way for Iran to substantially increase its regional influence through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and to some extent in Palestine, what was called the axis of resistance. Doesn't really get talked about the same way. So there's a series of outcomes from a war that was fought 23 years ago that helped shape and form the world we're in today. So the starting point for the war was 9/11. On the 11th of September 2001, Al-Qaeda flew planes into the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. It was a humiliation to the ruling class in the US, but it was also an opportunity to go on the front foot and exercise their military power. And George Bush said this on the 20th of September, 9 days after the attack: "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped and defeated." And that war on terror has framed in many ways international and domestic politics since. A series of laws which have restricted our civil liberties. They're not new. They're not just from the last 6 months or since Bondi. Actually, John Howard brought in wave after wave of legislation which limited people's rights. The war on terror also established in the minds of many people, and it was pushed from the top and in the media, that it was a war on Islam, and that there was a war between two civilizations. And there was a significant increase, and a sharp and significant increase in Islamophobia, reflected, as you would imagine, in attacks on Muslim women in the streets wearing the hijab, or men who look Muslim, or ironically men who were Sikhs, who were not Muslims. In one case, a Sikh was killed on the streets in the United States because brown people wearing turbans must have been terrorists. Now, Bush and his allies went in quite quickly into Afghanistan, but that was the easy part. Bush had a particular desire as somebody who had grown up from an oil dynasty family to want to get Saddam Hussein and Iraq, because at the beginning of the 1990s, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. He thought the US had given him the green light, whether they had or not. They then decided that wasn't going to happen, and they fought a war, which Australia was involved in, to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. But Saddam Hussein stayed in power and became a hate figure for Western imperialism. So Bush wanted to attack Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist, which means a secular nationalist, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and the kind of Islamism which it espoused. But Bush, nonetheless, went on the front foot. He felt that there was an opportunity to do this, and he was supported by John Howard here and by Tony Blair in Britain. And they set out, while they were building up military forces on the ground, including troops, to go in and invade, they started to make the case for war. They went to the United Nations. Critically, they argued that not only was Saddam Hussein the new Hitler, that argument got quite an outing, but that he had weapons of mass destruction, and they never said what they were, which probably scared people into thinking they were nuclear weapons. And they were only minutes away from being launched, and that's why the war was absolutely necessary. But millions of people around the world rejected this logic. They refused to go along with this logic, and we saw the emergence of a global anti-war movement. And it broke out. There were local peace groups in Australia, there were citywide organising, and the peace movement, or the anti-war movement, reached a crescendo on the weekend of 14th and 15th of February 2003. Here in Melbourne, it was the 14th of February. And across the world, 30 million people mobilised against the war on the streets. It is still the largest single coordinated protest action in human history. And the numbers are always a bit rubbery, but the general consensus is 1 million people were on the streets in Australia, probably 300,000 here, 400,000 in Sydney, and then across every capital city and regional centre. And the New York Times called us the other global superpower. Now, the invasion took place. It was wasn't painless, but relatively quick, a matter of a few weeks. But actually, this quick victory began to blow up in the face of the United States and its allies very, very quickly, partly because of the horror. The Lancet, which is the medical journal, estimated in 2006 that about 600,000 Iraqis died in the first 40 months of the war and the occupation. The Americans found it very difficult to keep control of Iraq, and so there was a lot of random arrests, shootings. People were taken into prison and they were tortured. Those of you who saw the Facebook event promoting tonight's meeting, there was an iconic image of a man standing with his arms out, completely covered in a hood and a black cloth with electrodes attached to his fingers. He was being tortured in Abu Ghraib prison, and the soldiers delighted in it. They took photos. They turned dogs onto the prisoners. So far from liberating Iraq, it was very clear very quickly that America had come to oppress it. And a resistance movement grew up very, very quickly. And some of those people were Baathists. They supported Saddam Hussein. But most of them actually were rising up in order to defend national pride against an invasion. And by October, most cities and towns were under the control of the resistance. In Baghdad, the Western forces were forced to retreat into what was called the Green Zone, which was a fortified area with embassies and hotels and, the luxuries of life. And to give you a sense of how powerful the resistance was, in the city of Fallujah in 2004, the resistance essentially defeated the Americans, took control of the city, or maintained control of the city. And the important thing to reference here was that the resistance was united resistance. It united both Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims across the sectarian divide. And the US Army had to come in massive numbers, and it took them 6 weeks to retake the city. It was the largest battle that America had been involved in since Vietnam. And even though they won that second battle, actually within months, the insurgents, the rebels, were in control of large parts of Fallujah again. And so the United States turned to sectarian division, divide and rule, which undoubtedly they would do in Iran if they ever had the opportunity, although I think that's much less likely. And they set about playing favourites between Sunni and Shia politicians and parties, and fomenting anger and friction between the two wings of Islam. It was very important to say that before the invasion, it was quite normal for people to have Sunni and Shia relatives in the same family, in exactly the same way that people here would know that they have Catholics and Protestants and whatever in their extended family. That was very much part of life. And that sectarianism then fed through into civil war, which the US fomented. And what that meant was that US imperialism, far from bringing peace and liberation, brought horror. US troops finally withdrew from Iraq in 2011, but they were back, like the Australian troops, in 2014. And the horror lives on. In 2022, World Vision says that at least 2.5 million people, including 1.1 million children, needed humanitarian assistance. Food, shelter, access to clean water. So the echo of imperialist bastardry lives on. I think it's important to say that there was always the potential in Iraq for resistance from below that would unite across the sectarian divide. I've mentioned Fallujah in 2004. Actually, Fallujah was obviously a hotspot. In 2013, there were anti-government demonstrations which united Sunni and Shia. In 2019, there was a movement, primarily amongst young Shia people, which forced the resignation of the Shia Prime Minister, and that won the support of people in the Sunni community. And part of the argument back in 2003, and we hear it echoed again today very much with Iran, is that only outside intervention can liberate people from tyrannical regime. And if the invasion had not taken place, I think we can have some confidence that the Iraqi workers and masses would have joined the Arab Spring of 2011 and could have dealt with Saddam Hussein themselves. And Western invasion, far from bringing liberation, actually closed off that option for a period. There is an argument, if you talk to older people who went on those rallies in 2003, many of them never actually got to march. On Swanston Street, most people just stood there for a couple of hours and went home because the march was so big that people didn't really go anywhere, but they took part. But there was a widespread consensus that we had failed. After all, we had these massive demonstrations and the war went ahead. And I think we need to be clear that the peace movement, the anti-war movement, did make gains. It blocked Bush from going much further. The project for the new American century saw a rolling series of interventions into countries, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Libya, Cuba, a rolling series of interventions which would follow on from the invasion in Iraq. Bush had to call a halt. Actually, Iraq, at least for a generation, or 20-something years, actually ruled out the possibility of the US making those sorts of interventions. I also think we should look back and say, notwithstanding the movement's failure to stop the war, US imperialism was defeated, and the mass mobilisations and the pressure it put on Western governments contributed in some small part. I mean, even here, in 2007, John Howard, who was a war criminal along with George Bush and Tony Blair, was defeated, lost his own seat in the election of 2007, and he was under enormous pressure in the run-up to that election to free 2 Australians who were being held in the concentration camp of Guantanamo Bay, David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib. And he was forced by the pressure of the movement to go to America and say, get these 2 men out of jail and bring them back to Australia. That was a victory. All right, to sum up, what are some lessons for today? Now, contrary to what the pessimists say, protests do work. Look at the impact of the thousands of people who were on the street in Minneapolis. It did work. ICE was essentially, in large part, driven out of that city because people mobilised incredibly bravely over and over again. But an imperialist state, when it goes to war, is not going to be pushed back as easily as a government that is doing some policing in a particular city at a particular time. Rallies by themselves will not be enough to stop the drive to war. And what was needed then, in 2003, and what is needed now, both to stop the war in Iran but also to fight for liberation for Palestine, is to turn protests into mass disruptive action and strikes, to actually put a spoke in the wheel of the system, in the way that the working class in this country did around Vietnam. Vietnam moratoriums were political strikes, workday strikes, where hundreds of thousands of workers struck against the war and created a political crisis for the government, along with all the other campaigning that was taking place. And I have to say that we are in some ways better off than 2003. It can sound fantastic, millions of people on the streets. Today, worldwide, we have a global movement for Palestine which has gone very, very deep into people's consciousness, which manifests itself in all sorts of ways, rallies and encampments. And critically, we can see the beginnings of the kind of action that is needed to stop war, and the strikes by workers in Italy and Greece. Briefly here, the disruption to the Zim shipping line on the waterfront, the protests outside the factories making F-35 parts. And I think compared to 2003, people are much more cynical of their leaders. Trump said, we've got to go in because they'll attack us really quickly, and everybody went, bullshit. Widespread feeling of bullshit, because people understand, have learnt painfully that our rulers lie. So, to sum up, I'd say this. I think the lesson of the Iraq War is that we can mobilise masses of people against US imperialism. We can defeat US imperialism, and that's the big way, not just us, but the resistance in Iraq and so on, that US imperialism can be defeated, and we can be a constituent part of that defeat. But if we want to stop wars before they start, or bring wars to an end before our rulers want to end them, we're going to have to build the kind of movement that can actually bring capitalism to a halt. And to do that, we need to win the idea to people that it's not just bad politicians, it's actually we're up against a system of capitalism and imperialism that breeds war, and we have to challenge the system at its root.